he stood before the judge, a billionaire grinning as his cutthroat lawyer displayed her seemingly worthless financial contributions to the packed courtroom. He thought he was stripping her of everything, leaving her destitute. He didn't know the very empire he was fighting to protect was already legally hers. The heavy oak doors of the New York State Supreme Court at Foley Square offered no insulation from the suffocating tension inside room 422. It was a brisk Tuesday morning in November, but the atmosphere within the courtroom was sweltering, thick with the kind of animosity that only a high-stakes divorce could breed. At the plaintiff's table sat Arthur Sterling, clad in a bespoke charcoal brownie suit that cost more than most people's vehicles. Arthur looked less like a man watching his 15-year marriage dissolve, and more like a corporate raider about to close a hostile takeover. He was a founder and CEO of Sterling Logistics, a massive supply chain tech firm valued at nearly $800 million. Beside him was his weapon of choice, Harrison Croft, a notoriously aggressive family law attorney from the elite firm of Croft & Associates. Croft was a man who made his living destroying the spouses of Manhattan's ultra-wealthy, ensuring ironclad prenuptial agreements held up against even the most sympathetic tears. A few feet away at the defense table sat Beatrice Sterling. She wore a modest tailored navy dress, her posture impeccably straight, her hands folded quietly in her lap. To the untrained eye, she looked like exactly what Arthur was trying to paint her as. A docile, out-of-her-depth housewife who had spent the last decade and a half simply riding the coattails of a visionary genius. Beside her was Jonathan Weaver, a mild-mannered, bespectacled attorney who looked remarkably unremarkable next to the flashy, booming presence of Harrison Croft. In the gallery behind Arthur sat Chloe Danvers, a 24-year-old former marketing assistant at Sterling Logistics. She was Arthur's latest and most public indiscretion. Chloe wore a designer scarf and a smug, expectant smile, clearly waiting for the moment the judge would officially cast Beatrice out of the Sterling kingdom, with nothing more than the meager severance outlined in a draconian prenup signed 15 years ago. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Roth, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench who had seen every trick in the matrimonial playbook, peered over her reading glasses. Mr. Croft, you may proceed with your opening statement and the presentation of your financial forensics. Croft stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flair. Thank you, Your Honor. What we have here is a classic, albeit unfortunate, case of financial parasitism. My client, Arthur Sterling, built an empire with his bare hands. He worked 80-hour weeks. He secured the patents. He negotiated the mergers. And what did Mrs. Sterling do during this time? Croft paced the floor, clicking a remote that brought up a series of pie charts on the courtroom monitors. She spent, over the last 5 years alone, forensic accounting shows Mrs. Sterling has funneled over $3 million into frivolous art acquisitions, exorbitant charitable donations to foundations she personally favored, and various boutique investments that yielded zero return to the marital estate. She was a passive participant in my client's life, contributing nothing to the generation of his wealth. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He wanted this to be public. He had intentionally refused arbitration, opting for open court proceedings to humiliate Beatrice. He wanted the world to know that she was nothing without him. Furthermore, Your Honor, Croft continued, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls, we have a binding prenuptial agreement signed by both parties in 2011. It clearly stipulates that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Butt Sterling is entitled to a lump sum of $1.5 million, plus the primary residence in Connecticut. All business assets, intellectual property, and corporate holdings remain the sole and exclusive property of Mr. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling is now contesting this agreement, demanding half of a company she doesn't understand. We ask the court to enforce the prenup and dismiss her baseless claims for equitable distribution. Judge Roth turned her gaze to Beatrice's table. Mr. Weaver, does the defense have an opening statement? Jonathan Weaver stood up slowly, adjusting his glasses. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. Your Honor, Mr. Croft has painted a picture of a wife who simply consumed wealth while her husband built it. We intend to prove that Mrs. Sterling was not merely a passive beneficiary of Sterling Logistics, but its foundational architect. Moreover, regarding the prenuptial agreement, we will demonstrate that it is entirely moot, not because it was signed under duress, but because the assets Mr. Sterling believes he is protecting no longer belong to him. Oh, but a ripple of murmurs broke out in the gallery. Arthur let out an audible scoff. Croft rolled his eyes, whispering something into Arthur's ear that made the billionaire chuckle. A bold claim, Mr. Weaver, Judge Roth noted, her interest clearly piqued. You may call your first witness. The defense reserves the right to call our witnesses after the plaintiff has presented his case, Your Honor. Weaver replied smoothly, sitting back down. Croft immediately seized the floor. The plaintiff calls Arthur Sterling to the stand. Arthur strode confidently to the witness box, placing his hand on the Bible and swearing to tell the truth. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes cold and triumphant. He had spent the last 2 years quietly shifting his assets, restructuring his companies, and creating an impenetrable fortress of offshore accounts and shell corporations. Even if Beatrice somehow managed to void the prenup, she would find that the Arthur Sterling she was divorcing was, on paper, completely broke. He had outsmarted her. He had outsmarted everyone. Also, he thought, Mr. Sterling, Croft began, adopting a tone of deep respect. Could you describe for the court the early days of Sterling Logistics? For the next hour, the courtroom became an audience for Arthur's ego. Guided by Croft's carefully curated questions, Arthur spun a masterful narrative of the self-made man. He talked about the sleepless nights in his garage, the initial rejections from venture capitalists, and his ultimate triumph in securing a proprietary algorithm that revolutionized freight tracking. And during these critical years of innovation, Croft asked, did Beatrice Sterling offer any technical expertise or business strategy? None, Arthur answered flatly, looking directly at the judge. Beatrice was supportive in the way a spouse is expected to be. She managed the household, but she didn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a profit and loss statement. I kept my business entirely separate from our home life. It was safer that way. To your knowledge, did she ever invest her own capital into the company? No, Arthur chuckled. She didn't have any capital. When we met, she was working as a junior archivist at a local library. I provided everything. Croft turned to the judge. Your witness, Mr. Weaver. Jonathan Weaver stood, picking up a thick manila folder from his desk. He walked toward the podium, taking his time. The silence in the room stretched, becoming taut and heavy. Mr. Sterling, Weaver began, his voice calm and methodical. You just testified that you kept your business entirely separate from your home life. Is that correct? Yes. And you consider yourself a meticulous businessman? I do. Let's talk about that meticulousness, Weaver said, opening the folder. 3 years ago, Sterling Logistics experienced a severe cash flow crisis. You were on the verge of defaulting on a massive loan with First Republic Holdings. Do you recall this? Arthur's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. Every business faces hurdles. We restructured and overcame it. You did, Weaver agreed. You secured an emergency equity injection of $50 million from an anonymous angel investment firm called Vanguard Apex Partners. In exchange, Vanguard Apex received a 49% stake in your holding company and a silent seat on the board. Is that accurate? Arthur glared at Weaver. Yes, it was a standard venture capital rescue. They provided the liquidity. I kept control. Right. You kept 51%, Weaver said, pulling out a document. Your Honor, I am submitting Exhibit A into evidence. The equity transfer agreement between Sterling Logistics and Vanguard Apex Partners. Judge Roth nodded, accepting the document from the bailiff. Admitted. Now, Mr. Sterling, Weaver continued, adjusting his glasses. A year after that, anticipating this very divorce, you began moving your remaining 51% of the company's liquid assets and intellectual property out of the United States. You transferred them to a Delaware LLC called Osprey Capital. Croft shot up from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory accusations without basis. My client restructured his company for tax efficiency, a perfectly legal corporate maneuver. Overruled, Judge Roth snapped. I want to hear where this is going, Mr. Croft. The witness will answer. Arthur crossed his arms, leaning back. As my lawyer stated, Osprey Capital was established for domestic tax strategy. And from Osprey Capital, Weaver pressed, unfazed. The assets were funneled into a trust in the Cayman Islands, known as the Aegis Trust. A trust designed to be impenetrable to domestic lawsuits. A trust that, on paper, leaves you, Arthur Sterling, with a personal net worth of roughly $200,000, while Aegis holds over $400 million. Arthur smiled, a thin, predatory smile. He had paid millions to top-tier financial architects to build this exact labyrinth. He knew Weaver couldn't pierce the corporate veil of a Cayman trust. Let him complain about it. It wasn't illegal, and it meant Beatrice couldn't touch a dime. Corporate structuring is complex, Mr. Weaver, Arthur said condescendingly. The assets are managed by independent trustees. I do not have direct control over them, which means they are not marital property subject to distribution. I am just a beneficiary of the trust's dividends. Exactly, Weaver said. The lawyer didn't look defeated. He looked strangely satisfied. You gave up direct ownership of your 51% protected from your wife. You placed it entirely in the hands of the Aegis Trust. I placed it in a secure financial vehicle, yes, Arthur corrected. Weaver walked back to his table and picked up a second, thinner folder. Mr. Sterling, when you transferred your controlling shares to the Aegis Trust, you signed over proxy voting rights to the Trust's anonymous primary director, correct? You trusted your financial advisors to manage the director appointments. Arthur frowned, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his eyes for the first time. Yes, the director of the trust votes the shares, but the director is bound by fiduciary duty to the trust. Your Honor, Weaver said, turning to the bench, I am submitting Exhibit B. This is the unredacted incorporation and directorship registry for the Aegis Trust, obtained through a recent international transparency subpoena. Croft stood up, looking alarmed. Objection! We have not been provided with this document in discovery. You weren't provided with it because the defense only received it at 8 o'clock this morning from the Cayman authorities. Weaver countered smoothly. It is a public registry document, Your Honor, recently unsealed. I will allow it, Judge Roth said, her eyes scanning the paper the bailiff handed her. She raised an eyebrow, looking from the paper to Beatrice, and then to Arthur. Proceed, Mr. Weaver. Weaver turned back to Arthur. Mr. Pass. Sterling, do you know the name of the primary director of the Aegis Trust? The person who currently holds the proxy voting rights for your 51% of Sterling Logistics. It's an independent financial officer, Arthur said, his voice losing some of its arrogant edge. A proxy firm. No, Mr. Sterling, Weaver said softly, the silence in the courtroom amplifying his words. The primary director of the Aegis Trust, holding full, irrevocable voting rights and total control over the trust's assets, is an individual. Weaver walked over to the defense table and stood behind Beatrice. She finally looked up, meeting Arthur's gaze. Her eyes weren't docile or frightened. They were completely, terrifyingly cold. "Her name," Weaver said, "is Beatrice Sterling." The courtroom erupted. The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a polite murmur. It was a cacophony of gasps, hurried whispers, and the frantic shuffling of papers. In the gallery, reporters who had been half asleep suddenly sat bolt upright, their pens flying across their notepads. Chloe Danvers dropped her designer handbag, the loud clatter echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. Arthur Sterling's face drained of color, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stared at his wife, his jaw unhinged. That's a lie," he stammered, his voice devoid of its former booming authority. He turned wildly to his attorney. "Harrison, he's lying. Tell the judge he's forging documents." Harrison Croft was already on his feet, his usually perfectly combed hair slightly disheveled. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous fabrication, a stunt. My client has never authorized Beatrice Sterling to act as a proxy for the Aegis Trust." Judge Evelyn Roth slammed her gavel down, the sharp crack cutting through the pandemonium. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom or I will clear the gallery." She glared down at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Croft, sit down. I am looking at an official apostilled corporate registry from the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. It bears the official seal of the registrar. Unless you have definitive proof of forgery right this second, you will lower your voice." Croft slowly sank into his chair, furiously whispering to a junior associate to start making international calls. Judge Roth turned her piercing gaze to the defense. "Mr. Weaver, you have the court's undivided attention. Explain to me how a supposedly financially illiterate housewife became the primary director of a multi-million-dollar offshore trust." Jonathan Weaver smiled a small, polite smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. "Gladly, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling testified that his wife brought no capital to the marriage. He believed she was merely a library archivist. What he failed to uncover, because he never bothered to ask about her family, was that Beatrice Sterling is the sole surviving heir to the late William J. Gallagher." Arthur blinked, confusion fighting through his panic. "Who? William J. Gallagher?" Weaver repeated, savoring the syllables. "A remarkably successful, incredibly private Boston real estate developer. When he passed away 8 years ago, he left his entire estate to his granddaughter, Beatrice. Liquidating those assets provided Mrs. Sterling with a private net worth of roughly $90 million. Arthur gripped the edges of the witness stand. She never told me." "Because you never asked, Arthur," Beatrice spoke up. It was the first time she had spoken in court. Her voice was calm, melodic, and completely terrifying to the man sitting on the stand. "You needed to be the smartest person in the room. You needed to be the provider. I let you have your illusion. But letting you have your illusion didn't mean letting you destroy the company," Weaver smoothly interjected, directing the judge's attention back to the timeline. 3 years ago, Sterling Logistics was bleeding cash. First Republic Holdings was about to foreclose. Mr. Sterling was desperate. Suddenly, an anonymous angel investor, Vanguard Apex Partners, swooped in with a $50 million lifeline in exchange for 49% of the company. "Vanguard Apex," Arthur whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Yes," Weaver nodded. "Vanguard Apex is a holding company entirely owned and operated by Beatrice Sterling. She bailed you out. She saved the company. But she did it anonymously, knowing your ego couldn't handle being rescued by your wife." "Objection," Croft shouted, desperate to regain control. "Relevance. Even if Mrs. A. Sterling is Vanguard Apex, that only accounts for 49% of the company. My client still retains the 51% majority through the Aegis Trust. Which brings us to the Aegis Trust, Weaver countered seamlessly. A year ago, when Mr. Sterling began his affair with Miss Danvers, he anticipated a divorce. He wanted to hide his 51%. He consulted his board of directors, which included the anonymous proxy from Vanguard Apex on how to protect his assets from his wife. Weaver picked up a thick stack of emails and waved them slightly. Vanguard Apex, meaning Mrs. Sterling, highly recommended a boutique offshore financial management firm to set up the trust. Mr. Sterling, believing Vanguard Apex to be his trusted billionaire allies, blindly followed their advice. He signed the paperwork establishing the Aegis Trust, transferring all his assets into it, and irrevocably signing over proxy voting rights to the firm's appointed director. Weaver took a step closer to Arthur. You signed contracts you didn't read carefully, Mr. Sterling. Patrice Singh, because you were too busy trying to hide your money. You didn't notice that the boutique firm was a subsidiary of Vanguard Apex. You literally handed the keys to your entire empire to your wife, begging her to keep it safe from your wife. Arthur looked as though he might physically be ill. He looked at the documents on the monitor, then at Beatrice. This is fraud, Arthur choked out. She manipulated me. It is not fraud to allow a man to walk into a trap he built himself, Weaver stated coldly. You sought to hide marital assets offshore. You signed the documents of your own free will. You gave up ownership to a trust. The fact that you didn't do your due diligence on the trust's director is a consequence of your own arrogance, not my client's fraud. But the silence that descended upon the courtroom was absolute, possessing a physical weight that seemed to press the oxygen from the room. Even the relentless rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to hesitate. The gallery was entirely frozen, a tableau of open-mouthed reporters, stunned spectators, and a deeply horrified Chloe Danvers, whose knuckles had turned white as she gripped the wooden railing in front of her. Harrison Croft finally shattered the quiet. He lunged out of his chair, his face a mottled, apoplectic purple, his previous slick composure entirely obliterated. Your Honor, this is a profound violation of the law. Croft bellowed, slamming his fist onto the plaintiff's table so hard the heavy oak shuddered. This is a clear, undeniable breach of fiduciary duty, even if we entertain the notion that Mrs. Sterling is the proxy director of the Aegis Trust. She is legally, ethically, and strictly bound to act in the best financial interest of the trust's sole beneficiary, my client, Arthur Sterling. She cannot utilize a loophole to extort him in the middle of a matrimonial dispute. We demand an immediate injunction. Judge Evelyn Roth slowly leaned forward, intertwining her fingers and resting her chin upon them. Her expression was utterly unreadable. Is she extorting him, Mr. Croft? She is attempting a hostile takeover of his life's work. Croft shouted, spittle flying from his lips. No, Your Honor, she is not, Jonathan Weaver corrected. His voice remained perfectly modulated, a cool breeze cutting through Croft's localized hurricane. Mrs. Sterling has absolutely no intention of violating her fiduciary duty to the Aegis Trust. In fact, she takes her legal obligations to the trust with the utmost gravity. The trust's foundational mandate, the very mandate Mr. Sterling's own expensive lawyers drafted, is to protect, preserve, and grow the core assets of Sterling Logistics. Weaver reached into his impeccably organized briefcase and withdrew a single, heavy stock document sealed with a gold corporate emblem. He held it up for the court to see, which is precisely why yesterday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Mrs. Sterling convened the mandatory emergency shareholder meeting, Weaver continued, his words falling like hammer blows on the silent room. As the sole owner of Vanguard Apex, She holds 49% of the company. As the irrevocable voting proxy for the Aegis Trust, she controls the remaining 51%. Therefore, Mrs. Sterling currently commands 100% of the voting shares of Sterling Logistics. Arthur's eyes dilated, panic finally overriding his shock. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. "What did you do?" he hissed, turning his head slowly toward his wife. "Beatrice, what did you do?" Beatrice Sterling stood up. She took her time, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress with steady, deliberate hands. The posture that Arthur had always mistaken for meekness now radiated an undeniable, overwhelming authority. When she looked down at Arthur, he seemed to physically shrink into his expensive Brioni suit. "As the sole voting power of Sterling Logistics," Beatrice said, addressing the judge but keeping her glacial gaze locked firmly on her husband, "I conducted a comprehensive review of the company's recent performance. The current chief executive officer has been chronically distracted, financially reckless, and has engaged in highly questionable, self-serving corporate restructuring that jeopardizes the company's public standing and core valuation." She paused, letting the silence amplify her next words. "Therefore, acting in my capacity as the board, I voted to terminate Arthur Sterling as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. He is dismissed for cause. Under the bylaws he himself established, termination for cause invalidates all executive severance packages." Arthur snapped. He lunged forward, throwing his weight over the wooden partition of the witness stand, his face contorted in sheer, unadulterated rage. "You can't do that to me. I built that company from nothing. It's my algorithm. It's my blood. It's mine. Bailiff." Judge Roth barked, her voice cracking like a whip. The armed court officer instantly closed the distance, resting a firm, threatening hand on his holstered weapon. Arthur froze mid-lunge. His chest heaved violently, his hands trembling with a mixture of impotent fury and utter despair as he slowly sank back into the witness chair. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Roth said, her voice dripping with a profound, icy disdain, "you swaggered into my courtroom this morning demanding that I strictly enforce a prenuptial agreement. You intended to cast your wife out with a house and a paltry $1.5 million. While you walked away with a billion-dollar empire you deliberately tried to hide in an offshore labyrinth." She picked up her heavy silver pen, tapping it methodically against her leather-bound ledger. "In the eyes of the law, the equitable doctrine of unclean hands prevents you from seeking this court's protection regarding the Aegis Trust. You created that entity specifically to defraud your spouse. This court will certainly not help you dismantle it now, simply because you realize you outsmarted yourself." Judge Roth looked down at her final ruling sheet, her pen hovering over the signature line. "The court finds the prenuptial agreement valid, binding, and enforceable, exactly as the plaintiff requested in his opening statement. Beatrice Sterling will receive the Connecticut estate and the $1.5 million lump sum." Arthur let out a hollow, broken wheeze. He had won the battle of the prenup, but the victory was a lethal poison. "Furthermore," the judge concluded, her voice ringing with finality, "the court recognizes that Arthur Sterling possesses no legal ownership of Sterling Logistics, having voluntarily and permanently transferred his assets to an irrevocable offshore trust. The directorship of that trust remains a private corporate matter entirely outside the jurisdiction of this divorce proceeding. Mr. That with Thingle Howe Sterling, you are left with exactly what you legally own in your personal name, almost nothing." Judge Roth raised her gavel high. "This divorce is granted. Court is adjourned." Crack. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot, signaling the definitive end of Arthur's reign. Arthur slumped back in the witness chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. Beside him, Harrison Croft was already frantically shoving files into his leather briefcase, aggressively avoiding his client's vacant stare. A mercenary lawyer like Croft did not waste billable minutes comforting a man whose net worth had just evaporated. In the gallery, Chloe Danvers slowly stood up. She looked at Arthur, a man who was no longer a tech titan, but an unemployed, asset-stripped pariah with a public relations nightmare on his hands. Without a single word or backward glance, she turned on her designer heel and practically sprinted out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her with a definitive thud. Beatrice Sterling quietly picked up her modest purse. She didn't gloat. She didn't offer a dramatic parting remark. She simply looked at Arthur one last time, her eyes filled with the cool detachment one reserves for a stranger who has made a catastrophic error in judgment. She had spent 15 years being chronically underestimated. She would never be underestimated again. Flanked by Jonathan Weaver, Beatrice walked purposefully down the center aisle of the courtroom. She held her head high, stepping completely out of her husband's shadow and into the glaring light of the empire she now entirely owned. Did you see that massive twist coming? Arthur's blind arrogance prevented him from seeing the brilliant strategist sitting right beside him for 15 years. Never underestimate a partner who builds in silence. If this epic courtroom takedown gave you absolute chills, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who loves sweet justice. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life revenge stories and incredible legal dramas.